thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this talk. So the book I'm going to be talking about today is The Deficit Myth. It's written by Stephanie Kelton, who's an economist. She's worked in academia and in Washington. I think she was Bernie Sanders' economic advisor for a good bit. And I think she was around for the Obama administration as well. But her book has gotten quite a bit of acclaim in the last year or so, and is based on MMT, so modern monetary theory. It's kind of this new way of thinking about how we manage the macro economy. So if you want to go ahead, if you could just go to the next one, come on. Yeah, so the first lesson to take away is that the government is not a household. So we often think of the government's budget as a household budget. So you often hear like, how are we going to pay for things? Or we're not going to be able to afford certain social programs. The deficit myth kind of aims to discredit the idea that deficits matter and kind of pave a way for an economy where people are the focus of the economy. So MMT essentially, in more complex terms, like views inflation as a key determinant of government spending. So fiscal policy, according to MMT economists, should play a much larger role than monetary policy in steering macroeconomics. That's much more complex than I'll talk about today, but that's kind of the general idea behind MMT. So as far as the household budgeting, so Kelton argues that the claims that we should view the government's budget as a household budget come from a fundamental misunderstanding of how the government uses currency. So the government, unlike us, is a currency issuer. They issue currency rather than use currency. So they don't have to tax money before they spend money. So we might think of how we would spend our money, we would have to earn it first. That's not the case. And in fact, the government has to give out money before it can take money back. If you think back from the beginning of time or whenever the government initially started issuing currency, they wouldn't be able to take currency away from us as citizens before they could, or before they spent it. So that's a good way to think about it. The next thing that I kind of took away from the book was that the government's deficit is its citizens' surplus. So when the government runs a deficit, and just to clarify, so like a deficit is when the government has like a negative budget, right? When the government runs a deficit, that deficit is a surplus, at least for someone in society. So just by default, it has to be a surplus for some people. It could be for the NHS, it could be for wealthy corporations or business owners, but just by the nature of the government running a deficit, it has to be someone else in society's surplus. The opposite is also true. So if the government budget is in surplus, say the government taxes more money than it actually spends, then it's taking money out of society. So it's making the wealth of its citizens collectively poorer. Again, that who that affects is going to be dependent on like policy, but just by the nature of the government running a surplus, they're taking money, they're extracting money out of society. The idea that the government deficits make us all poor is quite prevalent in economics and in politics especially. So you always hear things like, how are we going to pay for this in the future? We're putting this burden on our future generations. But the idea that government deficits make us all poor is actually counterfactual, and that government deficits make us all wealthier. Again, who actually benefits from that wealth is definitely a matter of policy, but they're inevitably someone's surplus. The next thing, let's see. Deficits are not evidence of overspending. Inflation is. So we constantly point to the deficit as evidence that the government can't manage its finances, I know I was listening to the budget of Rishi Sunak's just two weeks ago, and he constantly says things like we have to get our house in order, which is just like a direct allusion to the household budgeting thing, which is just categorically false. But you constantly hear these tropes about overspending being, or I mean deficits being like the indicator of overspending. Stephanie Kelton and MMT more broadly says that it's not deficits, it's inflation. So inflation should set the rate at which a government spends. And of course, no one wants inflation, at least not a lot, but we do want some level of inflation. So it's largely a consensus amongst economists that 2% inflation is beneficial. Um, what we've seen in the last decade or so is that central banks, whether you're talking about the Bank of England or the Fed in the US, they can't hit that inflation target. So they can't get to 2%. They're experiencing in the UK right now 0.8% inflation. And that's following printing billions and billions of pounds, right, for the whole COVID-19 episode and trying to stimulate the economy. We're still at 0.8% inflation here. So that would, to an MMT economist, indicate that the government's not spending enough, not that they're overspending. All right. So Kelton argues that the best way to stabilize the business cycle is with a national jobs guarantee. So I really love this idea. When we think about what the minimum wage is right now, and she makes this point explicitly, the minimum wage is, I'm not sure what it is in the UK, I haven't lived here that long, but it's what, 10 pounds or 9 pounds or something. The actual minimum wage is zero because you're not guaranteed a job in any way. There are millions of people who want to work and are forced out of the labor market due to fiscal or monetary policies. So the best way to stabilize the business cycle, and the business cycle is kind of a fancy talk for the ebbs and flows of the economy. We have expansionary periods and contractionary periods. The best way to stabilize that cycle is with a national jobs guarantee. So right now, the government would pay the people that it effectively keeps out of the labor market to stay home, whether it's through universal credit or some type of unemployment insurance. And obviously, there are people that need those services, but the vast majority, or at least a significant portion of those people, they want to work, they want to contribute, they want to earn their way in some way. So if we could, if the government ensured a job for those people, they would not only have the opportunity to work, but the government would also effectively set the minimum wage. So whatever wage the government would offer, that would set the minimum wage for private interests as well. If I'm a private company, I'm going to have to offer the same wage that the government offers, or the people that I need to work for me would just go work for the government. So it would set kind of a living standard bottom, and it would also set a minimum wage bottom, and that would definitely be hugely advantageous. There's also a big psychological benefit that I think it would have in society, and she doesn't talk about this much, but essentially you have like a lot of animosity for people that don't work, and a lot of times, most of the time, that's not their fault. These are due to policies that limit the expansion of the economy. So whether it's monetary policy where they're raising interest rates too fast, or it's fiscal policy where they're cutting spending, or they're giving terrible raises in the NHS right now, so people are drawn to the private sector. Like these policies are effectively limiting people from working. So I think kind of setting setting an effective bottom would definitely provide like an added societal benefit. It would provide like a level of cohesion where we would kind of got a question. I'll get to the questions here at the end if that's all right. But yeah, just setting a bottom would definitely, I think, give people dignity, and it would um, also it would hugely increase productivity, right? So you would have things like improvements to infrastructure. You'd have things like childcare. All these services would become possible with a federal jobs guarantee. And that again would be just hugely beneficial for society. One more point on the national jobs. We also know that it's incredibly hard to find a job when you don't have a job. The longer somebody's out of employment, the harder people have trying to find a new job. So acting is like an intermediary between private sector jobs. Say if the government were to guarantee a job, they would act as an intermediary between different private jobs. That would also kind of smooth that cycle, which would be definitely advantageous. All right. And the final point, Kelton doesn't explicitly state this again, but it's kind of my takeaway, and I think it's definitely worth mentioning. Economics is about people. We constantly hear about economics as this super complex mathematical modeling, or the economics is about corporations or businesses or even politics. But at the heart of economics is people. Economics is a social science. It's about societies organizing, how we as economic actors, and we're all economic actors, whether you like it or not, how we organize and how we improve prosperity. Um, we've kind of made economics inaccessible because we've misled people about who is deserving to have a say in economics, or who should be at the table to discuss some of these things. But it's simply about human behavior. Of course, there are the business aspects, there's the corporate aspects, and there's definitely like place for some of the more complex modeling and such. But those shouldn't be the end, but rather a means to an end, right? The ultimate end again should be human prosperity, and that's not really just like my idea. Of course, that's my belief on it, but that's really what we're seeing kind of from a lot of new economists that are taking a new focus on the person or society as the focus of economic policy, and that's really exciting to see. All right, so just to go over the five things I mentioned. So the first takeaway is that the government is not a household. We have to earn before we can spend. The opposite is true for the government. The government has to spend before its citizens can give money back, right? The government has to give out money before they can tax it back. The second point is the government's debt is its citizens' surplus. So when the government does spend or run a deficit, actually, it's somebody's benefit. It's somebody's surplus. So again, it could be anyone's surplus. It might not be yours or mine, but it's someone's simply by the nature of accounting. The third point is inflation is king. Oftentimes, when you start talking about printing more money or making an argument to print money, you're going to hear, what about inflation? That would be, I think, right at the top of just about anyone's list. But MMT or modern monetary theory, it doesn't ignore inflation at all. It's quite the opposite. It argues or positions inflation as the chief determinant of the amount of stimulus or fiscal stimulus that can be provided. The fourth point is we need a national job guarantee. That again sounds like a more radical policy, and I think is something that is hard to convince a lot of people, especially on the right, of that maybe people don't deserve jobs or I don't know other arguments, but it's not only advantageous for people who want a better society, it's advantageous for people who want a more productive economy. It's just not effective or productive to pay people who want to work to stay at home. So I think that if you could kind of make those arguments and kind of lay out some of the economic benefits, it's a much more convincing argument. And then finally, economics should work for everyone. Economics isn't about one segment of society. It's not about businesses or math. It's about people. It's about how we organize and the ways in which we produce things. So just keep that in mind going forward. And that's all I have.
Thanks so much for that, Zach. That was awesome, man. Yeah, a subject I've got to admit I don't know much about, and I think, as you said before, if you're going to start to get into economic theory, this probably is quite a good book to pick up first.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very it's an accessible book. You might find it a tiny bit challenging if you've never read anything about economics, but I don't think it would take more than maybe a couple of trips to Google to kind of figure it out.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for that. Thanks, Zach. We'll quickly move on from one hefty topic to the next. And yeah, there's a ton of questions actually.